Thank you for coming to the book launch and discussion for Moisés Naím's book, The End of Power. And for those of you who haven't been keeping track, Moisés has been on a whirlwind tour the last couple days. He was at the CFR the other day. Today he was on Morning Joe. The book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. It was reviewed in The Economist. It'll be reviewed in the New Republic. It will be reviewed in the New York Times. And I should say that the only way we were able to get him here today is I promised him that each of you would buy 2 copies of his book. So please.
Why only 2?
Well, I thought it to be modest. So thank you. And I'll give a brief introduction. Moisés is a good friend, has been for a long time, and a good ally and a good mentor, actually, to me. An incredibly decent person, and his bio goes on for a while. I won't try to quote all of it. What I like to say is, in the last couple of days, is Argentina has the Pope, Venezuela has Moisés. And as a fallen Catholic, I'm not Venezuelan, luckily. I would take Moisés. But he has been the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. He single-handedly converted it to a niche, oddly shaped, second cousin, if you will, to the Foreign Affairs, to make it stand on its own, to a popular, readable, I think very modern policy journal that I think that has set the tone for us, and certainly even for the magazine that I edit and that he's on the editorial board of, America's Quarterly. He has written a number of books, Illicit being the book before this, and now this. He has a television show on NTN 24, Efecto Naím, weekly news magazine. He's a columnist in El País. He's also a columnist in La República. He's a winner of the 2011 Ortega y Gasset Award for his outstanding writing. As you'll see in his discussion, Moisés is always taking the provocative and counterintuitive side of things, which I think is what makes him interesting. And it's been borne out in his activities as editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy and also in his writing. And at a time when everyone talks about the 1%, at a time when everyone talks about how the big banks are bankrupting America and bonuses are becoming higher and higher, Moisés has actually taken the opposite view, which is power has become more diffuse, that there's greater turnover, and this represents a series of challenges not just to businesses, but also to government and to international regimes. I'll let him talk about that. What we'll do is Moisés is going to talk briefly about his book, and then we have the pleasure of having Saskia Sassen, who's the Robert Lind Chair of Sociology and the Director of Global Social Thought at Columbia University, will talk about her reactions to the book. Moisés will respond briefly, and then we'll take questions from all of you for what I'm sure, knowing both of them, will be a very lively and intellectually stimulating conversation. So, without further ado, I also want to say there's a great quote on the back by Bill Clinton. And as Bill says, he's written for us, but I don't know him personally. But this book will change the way you think about politics and about society. And hopefully you'll leave here from this lunch changing with your mind and perspective changed as well. So thank you.
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for making the time in your busy schedules to be here. Thank you, Saskia. I think Chris didn't know when he invited Saskia to be here that we are friends. We have been friends for a long time. Saskia wrote very early on one of the first books on globalization. I was inspired by that book very early on. I think a lot of what has been written after that book on globalization is very derivative of Saskia's pioneering contribution, and she also is she's a very disruptor of academic boundaries and a transgressor, and that makes her very interesting, and I'm delighted that she's here to criticize my book. After the introduction, I think Chris did a fantastic job of summarizing the central messages of the book, and I will not take too much time. I hope we have a conversation, and that this, instead of a long-winded presentation, is just an open-ended, fun interaction with you all, Saskia and Chris and myself. The book is what Chris said. The book says that power is no longer what it used to be, that power today is easier to get, much harder to use, and is more fleeting. It's harder to keep. And moreover, this is happening everywhere. It's happening in the Vatican and the Pentagon, in large corporations and big governments, in big armies and big foundations and charities, in sports and culture. Wherever you see organized human undertakings, you will see that those that are running those organizations are more constrained and more limited in what they can do. This is, of course, not to mean that the president of China or the Pope or the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the CEO of JP Morgan are not very powerful individuals. Of course they are. And these are organizations that are very large, and the world is full of very, very powerful people. My argument is not that power does not exist in the world anymore. My argument is that those who wield power have less of it and are more constrained in what they can do. That the range of options that they have is less than what their predecessors had. And that includes President Obama and the president and the CEO of JP Morgan and other tycoons, as well as military leaders and religious leaders and the rest. Why? Why is this happening? Well, first, how do I argue this? The book has a bias for numbers, has a bias for statistics, has a bias for evidence. I was very self-conscious when I started writing the book about two things that are very intimidating to me. One is that it was a book about power. And power is, is not an original subject. Power has been discussed since age immemorial. You find it in the Bible, you find it in Egyptian texts, and so, some of the greatest minds in history have discussed power in very smart, intelligent way that I have no hope of replicating or adding much. So my only hope and my defense was to let the data do the talking and just rely on what's happening and just be very empirical about what's happening to power and just let the numbers, let the evidence tell the story. And so these assertions, a lot of them are backed with a lot of statistics sourced in the book. The second theme that made me self-aware and insecure is the notion that I was talking about this decay of power at a time in which the global conversation is running in the other direction. Is running in the direction of more inequality, more concentration of wealth, more concentration of power, and that's the zeitgeist. That's what you get, it's the 1%, the 99% that is getting excluded, and the 1% that is hoarding power and controlling, and Vladimir Putin and China rising, and that's the mindset of the conversation these days. Well, I disagree with all of that, and I was aware that my counter argument was runs against the major narratives that are now very common. Why is this happening? When you say this, the first instinct that people reply is, well, the internet, of course. The internet is doing this. And then social media, is Facebook and Twitter. That's what's happening. The powerful now have to contend with social media, and Mubarak didn't realize that Twitter was going to bring him down. Well, I also disagree with that. It will be foolish on my part to say that the internet is not an extremely powerful tool that is changing the world, that has empowered people that were excluded, that has opened spaces for exchange and gave voices to people that didn't have voice, and gave opportunity and created new institutions. All of that is absolutely true, and I don't deny it. What I say is that the internet and social media are tools, and tools need users, and the users have motivation and direction. And so, yes, of course, the internet and social media were important in the Arab Spring. But they did not cause the Arab Spring. There were forces at work that were far more powerful than social media. Tunisia, where the Arab Spring started, is one of the most successful North African countries in terms of the economy. It had the fastest economy, the fastest growing economy in North Africa. It had the most homogeneous population, and not as divided in terms of ethnicity, religion, and other divisions that plague a lot of Arab countries. It had a stable link with Europe. It was a country that you would say, this is among all of that neighborhood that is very unstable, Tunisia, it's okay. And that's where it all exploded. And exploded exactly because it was okay, meaning it had a very large, growing middle class, better educated, young, with aspirations, with better education, better health, and not enough opportunities. And that is what created the ferment that then was, as we know, it was sparked by a fruit vendor in the interior of the country that just one day decided to immolate himself because of the abuses of local government, and then that sparked everything as we know. Was social media important? Of course. Was the social media the cause of these things? Of course not. And the same in Egypt. There is a very recent fascinating report that tracked Twitter traffic at the time of the Egyptian upheaval. And what they discovered is that most of the traffic was not happening in Egypt. It was not in people in Tahrir Square were not busy tweeting. They were busy burning tires and overthrowing the government. The Twitter traffic was us, people outside Egypt, tweeting about it and commenting, and the big bulk of that was commentators outside Egypt, talking about what was happening in Egypt, and the such. So, yes, internet is very important and social media are important, but not the main drivers. So what are the main drivers in my judgment? There's a bunch of them, but I combine them in three large categories that I call the more revolution, the mobility revolution, and the mentality revolution. The more revolution is that we now live in a world of profusion, a world in which there is more of everything. There is more people. These more people have more of everything. There are more medicines and more guns. There are more political parties and more religions. There are more material well-being, and there's more of everything. Of course, what there's more of is people. Humanity that took all of its history to get to 2 billion people in 1950, and now we're 7. Only in the last 2 decades, 2 billion people were added to the global population. Not only there are more people, they are more urban. This is the first time in history, in 2007, first time in history that there are more people living in cities than living in rural environments. And I claim that that has huge consequences for the way you wield power. Those people that are now more and more urban are also younger. We have the youngest population ever in history of humankind. The number of people under 30 is now 3 times larger than it was in 1950. The number of people between 10 and 24 years of age is also the largest in human history. And they're better off. Global GDP has quintupled since 1950. Per capita GDP has to multiply 3.5 times. The World Bank has lifted 26 countries out of its category as low-income countries in 2006 and shifted them up, moved them up to the category of middle-income countries. According to the ILO, 38,000 people per day are lifted out of poverty in the last decade. So more people, younger, more mobile, and more educated, healthier, and materially better. And then that takes me to the mobility revolution. They move. It's not just that they are more, they move more. The number of people that live outside their country has increased by 37% in the last decade. And it's not just people that move. Technology, ideas, money, goods, services, pandemics, everything moves more. There are no longer captive audiences. And very often, power needs captive audiences. Power needs groups that are contained and retained within national boundaries. And that has become more difficult. Together, the mobility and the more revolution inevitably have consequences that I call the mentality revolution. Changes in mindsets, expectations, aspirations, desires, wills, intolerance. The notion that you go to one of these young millions and billions of young people and tell her or him, you're going to do this because that's the way it has always been done. That phrase has lost potency like never before. The notion that I will just accept things because that's the way things are done is no longer tolerable to a very large segment of humanity. There are some fantastic examples. One that I am very taken with is divorce rates among elderly people in India. They're soaring, and they're initiated by the women. These are marriages that took place 30, 40 years ago, and therefore they're arranged marriages. And now they're not taking it anymore. The women are not taking it anymore and are walking away from marriages. Why? Well, I claim it's because of the three revolutions. They have more, they are better informed, they have been empowered, they have seen examples, the demonstration effect, they can do it. The same is happening in the Gulf countries. And these are not just anecdotes. There is the worldwide survey, the World Values Survey, that has been taken for, I think, 3 or 4 decades or more. They survey a large number of people around the world in a large number of countries, and they ask them about values, and they ask them about opinions. And what you can see from the results, and you plot the trends, is the trends is unmistakable. People are moving towards much larger intolerance for authoritarian ways of doing things. Even gender equality is moving in the right direction, slowly and from a very low level, but it's moving towards more gender equality. Intolerance for imposition, intolerance for any stifling condition. You put them together, and that has huge consequences for power. What's happening is that power exists, and the powerful exist because they have barriers that shield them from the challenges of newcomers. And these barriers are becoming less protective because of by the three revolutions. The more revolutions overwhelms the barriers. The mobility revolution circumvents the barriers, and the mobility revolution undermines them. Together, they make the three barriers far less protective, and that's why power is decaying. There are 2 important questions left after I argue this. One is, so what? The second is, who cares? Actually, the second is what to do. If there are things about this that are not that good, what do we do about them? And my argument is that there is plenty to celebrate, welcome, and rejoice about the decay of power, is opening spaces and opportunities, but there is also a glass half full about it that can be very dangerous, and we can see it around us in terms of gridlock, the incapacity of governments to get things done, the proliferation of a veto world in which you have a lot of situations in which you have actors that just have enough power to block the initiatives of others, and no one has enough power to impose an agenda or get things going. That is happening in governments, it's happening in companies, it's happening in organizations. And that's a very bad situation to be in, and especially because of its global consequences. But I'm sure that Saskia and Chris and you will have interesting things to say about this. Thank you.
That was great. I can say actually it's a better presentation than the gave next door, so thank you. I mean it, actually. Saskia?
An enormous pleasure to be here and to discuss Naím's book. The way I read it, and I read it really with great interest, I really enjoyed it. Now, it must be said, for me it was almost like a page turner. Now, I'm an academic, stuck with academic text, where page turning is not the image that comes to mind. But so what I saw was a kind of a process of disassembling power through many, like he just described, through many, many different domains. I mean, really many domains. And then standing back, looking, okay, what's left over? And then sort of reassembling the category power. Now, it seems to me that this is an invitation to think about power. And that is a challenge, because power is a kind of term like the economy. Whatever. You know, there are certain terms that are invitations not to think, because they come with so much embedded meaning that they are truly invitations not to think. So when I do my own research, if I'm working on immigration, I cannot use the term immigration, because I say immigration, I've said it all, more or less, right? So what I saw in this book was really sort of the ongoing disassembling and then standing back. And as Naím just said, power is still there, big power is still there, but the difference is really that those with power have, number one, fewer options, number two, a bit less power, and number three, when they make a mistake, the price they pay for making that mistake is much larger than it used to be. Now, in this process, Naím really engages some great academic texts, like when you have your discussion about Weber and Coase, you know, in this case, the point of discussion was the notion that we're coming out of a modernity, the modernity of the 20th century, where centralization, bureaucratization, and scale, in other words, scaling up, really were positive forces. Number one, for power concentration. Number two, for making systems work. So it's not just about power. It's just a combination of, if you want, utilities, centralization, bureaucratization, and scale up. It made things work. And then as an added effect is that those with power really had power. We are having, and this is your argument, I think, we're having the hardest time moving on. We still think that if it's big, it's great. Now, we have some very good examples of big, Walmart, you know, et cetera, and they are certainly doing very, very well. But really, when you look at Walmart, its capacity, you don't discuss Walmart, I'm just adding. I just want to say that this is just my thinking, so if you disagree with that, you're disagreeing with me, not with him. But so Walmart is really a multi-sited event, extremely distributed. Logistics is at the heart. The most complex function of Walmart is not the products, it's not the management, it's the logistics. So it is not your typical Weberian or Coasian sort of argument, you know, for bureaucratization and centralization. Now, I was thinking, you know, there are a few authors that have, over the centuries, let's say, that have thrown out invitations to their readers to think about power. And of course, the most recent one, just to keep it in our little world here, is of course Joseph Nye with Soft Power. I see a difference between these two books because, in a way, what Nye is doing is diversifying power, right? So there is hard power and there is soft power. Naím takes really a couple of steps further in the sense of engaging power. Now, there is a lot to be said, but I just so I just want to now begin to raise a couple of questions. I don't know if there is time to answer, but so one of them is that when I was reading it, the image that kept coming is not simply there is no more power. Definitely, that's not the image, but some kind of complex powerlessness or a complex loss of power. This is not a simple loss of power. Those who find their power confined, they're still doing well. Thank you very much. You know, it's not that there is nothing. No, but there's a kind of complexity to the way in which they are losing power. That then immediately puts me on the other side of the divide. And my question then becomes, is this then also a situation where those without power experience a kind of complexity in their powerlessness. So Tahrir Square, where the main means of communication was the whole network of mosques, you're absolutely right, it was not Twitter. We were all Twittering the hell out of this. And so the notion is that, and then I come back to cities, messy, anarchic, complex, incomplete, not just your neat city, but a real city. That is a space where I think that those without access to formal instruments for making a politics, making a history, whatever, actually find themselves in a situation where their lack of powerlessness becomes complex. So there is this kind of a mutual going, there is a new zone, and I think we haven't gotten there yet. So what I see you marking is a kind of the last, gasps, if you want, of that older form, which in its most extreme really ends already in the 70s, frankly, in this country and in much of Europe, and then a movement towards another zone where we are not quite there, where the masses, some of the more, means that we're going to have masses of powerless, but insofar as many of them are in cities, their powerlessness will become complex as well. So that for me, that you have just launched a marking of an emergent condition rather than the end of that trajectory. Now, a couple of more sort of, these are all questions. What I just said is a question. I know it doesn't sound like one, but it's actually meant as a question. So the other thing is, you do not, if I remember correctly, make a big distinction between authority and power. So that's why I brought you the book, Territorial Authority Rights, because my buddies asked me, I wrote a book with that title, and I didn't use power, I used authority. And my buddies who know that power is really what I'm more obsessed about than authority, ask why. And I said, because authority is a major achievement. It is cleansed power. It's serious stuff. It does not sort of consist of hitting you over the head. And so I wanted to ask you just a couple of quick thoughts. When are you dealing with authority, which let's say is cleansed and more complex form of power than just power at the other end of the variable? And then the other one that I had is, see, what I was reading also in your text, but I did not see you articulate that, and maybe you disagree. It seems to me that one of the issues that has happened is that there is a systematicity that includes network, technological capabilities, that includes a multiplicity of different actors. It includes locations, new geographies, whether it is of power or whatever, of resistance. And to what extent power, as we have understood it, has partly shifted, only partly, away from firms, individuals, governments, to some sort of zone that is partly technological, partly consists, of people and firms and governments, but that there is something that is more than just people, institutions, and governments. Final question. In my reading, the executive branch of government in all our liberal democracies has gained power, not the state. And it has gained power because of globalization. Because when the IMF and the WTO and the 70 other regulatory institutions that have transformed the standards for everything, they only have dealt with the executive branch of government, whether it's prime ministerial or presidential. They don't want to deal with legislatures, nor would you if you are the IMF, right? Because it's a mess out there. So that the irony is that the executive branch of government has gained power in this epoch, a power that is not visible, a lot of informal power at the heart of that very formal institution that is the executive branch of government. And it has learned a kind of internationalism. Pity in my book, I don't want to offend anybody, is that internationalism has gone to support global finance, global firms, the global corporate economy. And the big question for me is, can that internationalism be reoriented towards questions of the global commons? Yes, an executive branch that is less accountable, but it has a bit of power, it has a bit of internationalism attached to it. Can we finally deal with global hunger, global poverty, global health, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you.
Well, I want to say not only are you here for a great discussion, you're also here for a historic moment. I think this is the first time that the word systematicity has ever been used in these four walls. I just want to say that. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Moisés, do you want to respond? And then we'll...
I'd rather not, but yeah. Very quickly, those are very good points, very complex. This is a very complex reading, Saskia. I will not do justice to your good questions, but let me just take pieces of your questions and try to address them. The difference between authority and power belongs to the almost theological conversation about power where taxonomies matter. You can go crazy by trying to identify first what is the definition of power, and second, what is the difference between power, influence, authority, legitimate authority, illegitimate authority. You know, there are people that make a living writing books about these definitions. And very quickly, I decided that I was going to stay away from that quicksand, that if I started there, I would never get out of there. So I used the very basic definition, that is, power is the capacity of one actor to get another actor to do or stop doing something. It's very basic, very primitive. It's a widely accepted definition. It's not the most complex definition, but it's all I needed. I didn't know. But I did, there is in the book a whole chapter about the history of power and how power has meant to be. And I do make a big deal out of the difference between power and influence. And authority is implied there. Power uses more coercion and changes the structure of incentives. So if we are in a real estate transaction, I can use power by changing the structure because I have the power to change the price. Influence is changing your perception about the deal, because I'm going to tell you that that property is very close to a very good school. I haven't changed the structure of the deal, I have changed the way you think about the deal, and I'm exerting influence and getting you to do something that I want you to do, which is buy the property. Not by forcing you or by creating incentives for you, by lowering the price, but by changing your perception about the value of the transaction. And this is a very basic example about the differences, but mostly I stayed away from the theological conversations about definitional aspects. I will, of course, take issue with the notion that people that have power are doing fine, thank you very much. Just go ask Muammar Gaddafi. Go ask Bashar al-Assad. Go ask the New York Times. Tell me if the New York, who would have said that the New York Times would have its power undermined by a thing called Craigslist or Google?
I didn't mean to say that. Did I say that? No, I didn't mean to say that. I agree with you.
No, the notion, what I am addressing is the notion that there is a lot of power and that the powerful people are doing well. Yes, the powerful people that are still in power are doing well, but retaining that power is becoming harder, and that's my point. You make a big deal out of the big financial titans and how. Well, think Bob Diamond. He used to be the chairman CEO of Barclays. After the financial crisis, there were about 5 banks, 5 financial groups that came on top. They bought everything, as the others were going bankrupt and Merrill Lynch was going under, Bank of America came over, and AIG was bought, and Lehman was bought by Barclays. And so at the end, you had 5 very large groups. And those were the masters of the universe. And people wrote books saying, well, these 5 plutocrats are going to run the world forever. 3 months later, after that book, Bob Diamond was fired. And he's no longer the chairman CEO of Barclays. Today, you can read in the newspapers that the top executives of JP Morgan are in Congress giving on a hearing, and that right now, in fact. So we can go down the people that are doing quite well. Think about Benedict. He had to resign for his first time in 700 years. All I'm saying is...
I agree with that.
Yeah,
I agree
okay.
completely with that.
I'm glad.
Not a problem. I really do.
Your second point, I also take strong issue and strongly disagree with the notion that the executive powers in liberal democracies have gained power and are more now powerful. I disagree with that. I think there's plenty of evidence that shows that that's not the case. You can see out of the 34 democracies that belong to the OECD, which is the rich countries club, only 4 of those 34 governments, the head of government, the prime minister or president, is of the same party as Congress or the legislative. They feel embattled, they are constrained, and the list of limits to their power has increased dramatically. Not only they have opposition parties of all kinds, they have far more intrusive and media scrutiny, they have central banks that limit what they can do, they have international multilateral organizations that also limit what they can do, they have non-governmental organizations and activists that wherever they move a finger, you have 10 NGOs claiming that cannot be done. They have a judiciary. Around the world, the judiciary has become far more activist. And judges' power has shifted in many ways from the executive to the judicial. You have devolution, in which to these days, state and local governments have gained a huge autonomy and can do more things. And, think about Spain. Think about Rajoy and Zapatero and dealing with Catalonia and the Basque Country, or in Italy. So devolution is very important. And finally, of course, central banks. In many countries, the governor of the central banks has a lot of power. If you ask me, in recent years, which institution has gained power and is a counterexample to what I talk about in the book, is central banks.
I agree with that.
Mario Draghi today is far more powerful than Merkel. Well, I won't know that far, but so that's my point, and that's where I take strong issue to the notion that the executive branch in liberal democracies has lost power. And finally, and this is a complex reply, in a lot of what you said, Saskia, there is it's very strongly colored by space. You give a lot of importance to space. And spatial considerations loom large in those explanations. And that's odd and peculiar at a time in which space is mattering less. And remoteness is becoming, and the possibility to operate remotely has become far more important and cheaper and more widespread. But that's a minor point. I think the general theme is that there is, and where you and I agree, and I think is the central message here, is that power is experimenting profound mutations. And just assuming that it's more of the same and the powerful are the ones that have always been powerful and there's nothing new under the sun is a very, very mistaken assumption to make.
I have to respond to 2 things.
Quick, yes.
Okay, when I said the executive branch of government, I did not mean the president or the prime minister. It includes the central bank. It includes all the core. It includes, in the case of the United States, the Pentagon.
Central banks are independent. They don't report to
they are
independent entities. They don't report to the executive government.
But a lot of what you responded there is the formal, diagram of what executive branch is, of what all of this. I mean, when you see this is a power that is to a very large extent informal. For instance, just to give you examples, when we deregulated and privatized, like to mention familiar ones, telecommunications and, some finance, let's say that. What happened? We took out powers from the legislature, oversight functions, functions of making law, and did they totally disappear? No. What we had, it starts with Reagan in this country, and it didn't stop. We have inside the executive branch of government sort of special commissions, special groups, informal groups, which include the central bankers, which include, in the case of regulating telecommunications, who are the experts? The ones who come from telecoms. So what you have is a lot of, the image that I use is the growth of informality and informal power at the heart of what, on paper, is a very formal institution. Now, so for me, the executive branch of government is an amalgam. And the State Department, if we are at war, the State Department is part of that. And the question is unaccountable power also, not the old power. The old power, I totally agree with what you said. Now, the other thing about space, space is not just place, space is also digital. So just what you were talking about, the Tahrir Square. So the people down there in the square, hey, they were busy doing their stuff, but the whole other world. And so I see that with a lot of initiatives that come from small groups often who are operating in places, but who are also operating digitally. So what you have is this multi-sited space, which is local groups all over the place. And communication is not the core thing. It is almost a subjective condition. They know we're not alone. And sometimes, even if they're not communicating, like the Twitter zone and Tahrir. And there is more to be said, but yeah.
I have questions as well, but I want to sort of bring everyone else into this discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Raul Gallegos. I'm a journalist. I had a quick question. I think you made a strong point that these revolutions of more, clearly take place in liberal democracies, and executive power is more tested in liberal democracies, and in some instances in countries where liberal democracy doesn't exist. But I was wondering what you would argue happens in places where liberal democracy is essentially not present. I think, I spent many years in Venezuela as a journalist, and of course that hits close to home for you. And you can see that in these places, either because they're populist governments that find ways to isolate themselves from the revolutions of more, and this prevents, the mentality revolution in many ways. And in the case of Venezuela, you've seen Chavismo being far more effective using the tools of globalization and social media to essentially propagate ideas that run counter to the revolutions of mentality. And this, in many ways, reinforces the power of the executive. So I'm wondering how you see that, and also if you see in any way these powerful executives and institutions or governments finding ways to adapt to globalization and use it for their own benefit. Thanks.
That's a very, very interesting question. I might have misspoken. I don't think that the three revolutions apply only in liberal democracies. If you ask me what is the country where the three revolutions are more extremely manifested that I have seen, is China. The more mobility and mentality revolution that is going on in China is awesome and quite incredible. And if I'm right, and the three revolutions generate the cauldron for the changes in power, you're going to see changes in power in China. I also would claim that Venezuela belongs there. The More revolution did touch Venezuela. Venezuela did not have such a windfall of money as it did under Chavez's 14 years of government. The changes in mentality in Venezuela are quite astounding. You can just go to the streets. That's not the country where I grew up. This is a very different country in terms of the mentality of the people, the expectations, the way of behaving, and all of that. And the mobility matters. There's no doubt that mobility matters. So my claim, and I may be overstating it perhaps, but my claim is that the three revolutions are present both in liberal democracies and in authoritarian governments. And in fact, my example about Tunisia, which was a dictatorship, or Egypt, belly that point.
I'm sorry, could I just
Quickly,
make one
yeah.
quick reply? I would argue that in the case of Venezuela, when you talk about mentality, it is surprising to see, and obviously you're from there, you have a better sense, but it's impressive to see how, in many ways, many Venezuelans from every walk of life and from every socioeconomic background have a certain expectation of the state somehow, taking care of their needs or delivering their sort of stake of oil wealth, as opposed to promoting, say, policies that would, lead to more job creation, that support more dependence, if you will. And I think in many ways, Chavismo seems to have used social media and other tools to sort of even propagate that thought. I don't know if that's something that you also see.
Very quickly, you're right in the sense of entitlement that all we Venezuelans have, but that means that we're a normal petrostate. You just find that in Saudi Arabia and in Russia, in countries that are very wealthy mineral, and have these huge windfalls. People think, well, a chunk of that is mine, and I'm entitled to get part of it. So that's what you saw. And we will continue to see, because I think that is part of being a petrostate. What you have said, I wrote a piece titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It was my obituary. I wrote an obituary for President Chavez that was published in Bloomberg Business Week, and it was titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of President Chavez. And the good was how much he empowered people that used to be excluded, ignored, and not. He brought the poor and the themes of poverty, exclusion, inequality to the forefront of the national conversation. And that has a huge consequence in the mentality. That was a mentality revolution.
Saskia has to leave to catch a flight. She leaves, she isn't storming out in protest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Except for the fact.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
except for the fact that she's actually, and it's a statement also that power still rules, because she's going down to meet the president of Columbia University and the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. So she's still paying homage to power when she leaves, but just not, it's not in protest to the book. Other questions? Yes.
Well, I'm a bit of a I don't know what to say, but it can be bothersome. I think that many women are male subjects. You see, I have a bit of a postmodern, so to me it's I need to, there's a kind of an immigrant man can be the equivalent of the woman, in a certain situation, So it is, I see a bit of a division. Now, I do think, having said that, I will say that a woman is a woman is a woman also, given genealogies of inequality around the condition of women, and that is what matters. So that even if you are a top corporate and you conduct yourself as if you were a man vis-a-vis all kinds of, say, women's issues, the fact that you're a woman has its own facticity that matters. And I think it can make a big difference, but it will certainly take explicit action. It's not enough just being there. We know that because quite a few women have been there. They are in these positions of power. So if they're not inclined to make that also a zone for advancing issues, it's not enough. Let's put it that way.
It's not enough to be a woman, you also need to be a feminist.
Exactly. That is one nice way of putting it. And I leave on that note.
And the facticity, another word that's never been said here, so thank you.
Another word that has never been
Yeah,
said.
I can guarantee it. No. Well, thank you very much.
As you can imagine, I'm not going to get even close to facticity in that. So let's move on. The question is, can I say a few words more about the good, the bad, and the ugly? Very quickly, the good that President Chavez did was, as I said, he empowered and brought to the forefront of the conversation themes that have always been with us, but never with the urgency, stridency, and vehemence that President Chavez gave to the issues. He also was very, very good at making the large majority of poor people feel that one of them was finally in power, and that he had their backs, and that he was taking care of them. Another very good thing he did, he activated a population that had been disaffected, disinterested by traditional political parties, that was largely apathetic. And now in Venezuela, no one is apathetic. Everyone has become politically opinionated, and many have become more participatory. So that's the good. The bad is that those that have become activated and politicized are the armed forces. What people don't realize is that Venezuela is a highly militarized regime. And almost a very large proportion of the top positions in government are held by military. The behavior, the rules, the ways of doing things are highly militarized. The economy, so the bad, continuing with the bad, Chavez does not leave a country that has a stronger democracy or a stronger economy. Much to the contrary, Chavez leaves an economy in shambles and a democracy that is going to take many years to restore to its full functioning due to its complete devastation of the checks and balances that are indispensable for a democracy. And there are more bad things. And the economy, of course, is a disaster. And we're going to see the central dynamics for Venezuela in coming months are going to be the economic crisis, and therefore forcing those in government to find explanations as to why, when El Comandante was in charge, things were much better than now. And their explanation and their justification is going to be based on scapegoating enemies abroad, typically the United States, who now we know President Maduro has already said 2 or 3 times that the United States assassinated President Chavez, and the internal enemies, the opposition and everything. So we know that is going to happen. And at the same time, they will be forced to make an economic adjustment because the laws of gravity also apply in economics. And therefore, they cannot contain the situation. So the economic situation without making changes. And so you can expect a situation in which they will have to do some of the adjustments that are in economic life that are going to be indispensable. In order to justify that, they would have to become more repressive in terms of the political situation and in terms of shrinking spaces for the opposition and for freedom. And the ugly has to do with Chavez's passivity and tolerance for a vortex of criminality and assassinations and homicides and corruption in Venezuela. Venezuela is now one of the countries with the highest homicide rate in the world, is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And Chavez essentially said and did nothing about that. In 14 years, he has a peaceful coexistence with murder.
Let's move on a little bit from Venezuela. Let's go back. By the way, on Venezuela, we have a friend of the organization who just published a book, La Última Hora, Diego Arria, who's a great friend of the ASCOA, great friend of ours. I want to give a quick plug to that, Diego, because good work. Yes?
And International Affairs. Thank you. I find it very interesting, the concept of power. And normally when we think of power, we think of who has power. And so whether it's between 2 people or in a group, is it a shift of power that you see? Is it a limited pie? That is, the power is more diffused and there's more roadblocks. So when you say it's the end of power, it's not that there's less of it. It's just that it's shifting in different directions. Is that what you mean?
That's another great question. So, yes, power is shifting. We know that power is shifting. I start the book by saying that. We know that power is shifting from the west to the east, from Europe, the United States to Asia. We know that it's shifting from north to south. We know that it's shifting from presidential palaces to public squares, for large companies, well-established brand names, to newcomers. I give the example of Kodak, that at some point had the monopoly of photographic equipment, and it was at almost the only, the biggest company in the world, and that Kodak went bankrupt. Almost at the same time that a new app called Instagram, with 13 employees, was sold for $1 billion, and is very important now in the world of photography. So we know that those shifts are happening. But my point in the book is that that is not all it is happening. Far more is happening, and I described what I believe that it's the more profound mutations that are taking place that are not just a shift in power, is a change in the nature of power. Because even those that gain power, because it has been shifting, that doesn't mean that they're more secure in their power. Power may be shifting to China, but China is also affected by the three revolutions and by the difficulties that those in charge in China will have in retaining, in exercising and in retaining power. And your very good point is that is power absolute or is a relative or absolute power? Is power like energy? That is, there is just a set, and power just moves, but like energy, but there is a given volume or quantity that is there and is just distributed in other way. I believe that no. I believe that some loss of power is taking place.
I want to actually use or abuse my role as the chair and ask you two questions, sort of that you sort of teased us with about sort of what to do, what is to be done, the old Lenin question. And the first being, you talk about sort of the diffusion of the collapse of political parties and the emergence of just an array of what they call in Peru Toyota parties, because all their members can fit into a Toyota. But how do you, I mean, the traditional cleavages that defined political parties in Europe have vanished. And the traditional cleavage between church and state, liberal, Christian Democrat, social Democrat, and Christian Democrat. Where is that sort of cleavage in which you hang sustainable cradle-to-grave type parties in which information is more fluid, people's commitments defy sort of ideological sort of menus? How do you do that in a way that sort of creates a much more sustainable means for governance and mobilization? And then the second question is throughout this book, very good book, excellent, is a certain fear about rising conflict. The disintegration of the state seems to be, not only in its capacity to negotiate things of global significance, climate change treaties and the like, but also in terms of the rise of pirates that you talk about. Are we looking at, because of this, the sort of disintegration of authority and the margins that could lead to greater cases of conflict, and then being hamstrung by the inability of the international system to respond as it would have, say, in Libya?
So you did read the book.
I did.
Those are very astute, two very astute questions. So let me start with the first part that has to do with political parties. I make a big deal out of bringing the political parties into the conversation, and my last chapter is about that, which surprises a lot of people because, as you know, political parties are not that prestigious these days. And that's because the last decade or so have been terrible for political parties and great for NGOs. I go and speak in college campuses, and you ask these 20-year-olds, I use this thing, I say, listen, there is this butterfly in Indonesia that is going extinct. And I'm creating an ungovernmental organization to go and try to save this, do something to fight the extinction of this butterfly in Indonesia. How many of you would like to join me? And you typically get quite a few of the students, of the youngsters, say, yeah, let's do it. Then I ask the same group, I'm going to join a political party. What would you like to join with me? Let's join the Democrats or the Republicans. But, let's, and they run for the exits. They don't want to hear about that. They're willing to put time and effort in trying to salvage a butterfly in Indonesia, but they don't want to think about or even touch political parties. And I believe that a democracy based on NGO will not work. I believe that democracies need strong political parties, not of the kind that we have now, but I believe that a lot of the problems that are going to flow from the decay of power at national and international levels require strong political parties that are more modern, more attractive, more alluring, that will make people like you want to join and spend time and help and learn. One of the functions of political parties is a training function, is try to explain. You see, if you are in an NGO that just worries about poverty in Africa, or worries about human rights in Burma, you can afford just to center on that issue. If you are in a political party or if you are in government, you have to have opinions about all of that, plus preschool education, nuclear weapons, drug use, healthcare, macroeconomic policies, the exchange rate, and a bunch of, and military expenditures. You have to have opinions about everything and what to do with people that are incarcerated and their health situation and how you're going to pay for all of that. So, and very often, very quickly in government, you discover, and in political parties, you discover what you don't discover in NGOs. And that is that often the choices are not between the great and the horrible, but between the horrible and the more horrible. And those are the dilemmas that governments have to face and political parties need to understand and help understand. If you're in an NGO, you know that the world is divided between those that want to save the butterfly in Indonesia and those that don't care. And it's very easy to have a tunnel vision about that. And I believe that it's very important that political parties become more alluring to young people and to everyone, that they become more effective, and that they learn from Al-Qaeda, and they learn from Occupy Wall Street. I'm not suggesting that political parties need to become cults with suicidal assassins. That's not my point about Al-Qaeda. But let's recognize that there must be something in an organization that is capable of recruiting, retaining, motivating, energizing young people and get them to kill themselves and have some horrible behavior. What is there that political parties can learn, can get inspired of, and try to replicate the energy, the enthusiasm, the motivation, the dedication, the time, to really change the world through political parties that work in a democratic environment? Same with Occupy Wall Street. What did that movement was all about? All of a sudden, 2,600 cities around the world found that in their squares there were people camping. And talking more or less about the same things, and they were leaderless, and they have the same structures of functioning, and they have the same agenda. In most of the cases, that was just a cathartic exercise that did not end with any consequence. In some others did, but there was something there. It was taking apathetic people that did not show a lot of interest very often about issues and mobilize them around the world. Again, I think political parties may learn a thing or two from that. And therefore, I believe what this reflects is that one of the downsides and one of the worries I have about the decay of power is what's happening in national politics, where we see a lot of stagnation, we see a lot of bad decisions taken too late, we see a lot of delusion, and you can see the debate in Washington, you can see the situation in many other countries where governing has become equivalent to gridlock, stalemate, and inaction. And that is even more worrisome to me because that has consequences for the global level, and that is what Chris asked me. The second question is about conflict. Globalization and other realities of today's world are creating a longer, more complicated list of problems that cannot be tackled by any country acting alone. The list is nuclear proliferation, is climate change, is migration, is pandemics, is terrorism.
Justin Bieber.
All of that, including that. It's very hard. Climate change will not be dealt with by any country acting alone. You need collective action. At the same time that the demand for effective collective action at the international level is booming, the supply is either stagnant or declining. In economics, when the supply is much larger than when the demand is much larger than the supply, you have inflation. In geopolitics, when that happens, you have a lot of people killed. Essentially, you need to have the capacity. You look at Syria. It's obvious that there is a need for external intervention to stop the massacres in Syria. It's obvious. And yet the world cannot get around to doing that. I would claim that even the European crisis is an example of the inability to work collectively and do something about it. And climate change is another, and so on. So yes, conflict will happen to the extent in which the international community cannot act together more effectively, and the international community will not get to act more effectively unless the member states have governments that are giving stronger mandates. And what is happening statistically around the world is that strong mandates are the endangered species. Landslide victories are disappearing, are becoming very, very infrequent. The notion that a government gets to power because a big chunk of the population voted for them and therefore have a strong mandate and they feel they can sit and do things, that has become very rare. What governments are getting from voters is divided government. Is the signal that we don't want you to have power. We want to curb your power in a variety of ways. And we're choking on checks and balances. Checks and balances are asphyxiating the executive branches around the world. And therefore, these governments cannot sit at a table with other governments and make the sacrifices, commitments, compromises, and the deployment of resources that these international problems require.
Okay, I want to take a whole bunch of questions because we have about 15 minutes, and I know we'll get back to, let me collect the others. Go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes. My name is Larry Bridwell, and I teach international business at Pace University, and I just had lunch the other day with a fascinating student who's from Iran, and he was describing the complexities there. And I would be very interested in how you believe your book applies to the future of Iran.
Go ahead, right there, green sweater.
My name is Rodolfo de Rothschild. I work with Seven Bar Foundation, but eventually I get in foreign affairs issues. Do you think the European crisis will soon push out the royal powers maybe in Europe?
That's real. Okay, anti-monarchic revolution. We'll get, yes.
Jennifer Sponsi, Consulate General of Canada. I wonder if the reduction of power among the powerful, amongst the powerful will lead to more power for the powerless. Could you speak a little bit about the powerless? Or does that also mean that they're also losing abilities and their kind of freedom to act?
Good question. So zero-sum game. All the way back, your hand, yeah, you're waving now, yep.
Thank you. John Camacho, economic and business consultant. I haven't heard the difference between power and the illusion of power. There is this, like in Venezuela, or like in even Egypt, the people who toppled the government, they had the illusion of being in power, but then when there were the new elections, they no longer have the power. The same thing in Venezuela. Chavez empowered the population that was disenfranchised. They had the illusion of power, but they didn't have the power. Chavez had the power. Can you make a difference regarding these two?
Okay. Was there any other hands up? Okay, then you had already had your hand up before. Yeah, you've already had a question. What's your question? I know, but people are asking questions. This is turning into a statement. Thank you.
You talked about the political parties trying to aggregate all of these sources of power, but we think about them as an institution as well. But going even beyond the institutions, how do institutions, in what we're seeing of more
all of the variables you meant, how are they supposed to sustain, or are they going to be succumbing to periodic drops in power and realignments and all of that? Oh, sorry.
Question right there.
Okay. I haven't read the book, and maybe if I've read the book, I probably would have a better sense of what I want to
You're
get.
part
But
of a very large majority.
I feel like I don't want to walk away with a gloomy sense of what your message is. Because you did start with giving us a sense of the definition of power and what's been changing using the 3 M's and the why and what do we do. I have a sense of, is your discussion, what you're presenting to us in the book, a necessary evil or a paradigm shift to something better to come? Or are we gloomed? And the reason I say that is that when I think of my role in power is very localized in city and state politics, city and state government, very limited to the US. And when I take what you're addressing here, I had a chance to see you on your discussion on the CUNY television or the station. And you said a lot that you were saying here and more that I was able to pick up. But what I'm getting at is if I'm going to be having a discussion with people about your book over dinner or so forth and talk about, for instance, to some of the questions that were raised here, there are people, for instance, let's say the Hispanic community, through years of being in the political process and politically engaged, that there's a sense that they have developed some power. And so the reason I say is this, do we want to go back to where the power was not diluted and therefore we didn't have a voice? Or so share with me what is to come, where we're going with this.
Okay, great. So basically also the cocktail conversation you want, so you can talk about it with your friends tonight. Moisés.
So you're going to have dinner about the book, invite me, I'll come. A lot of very, very good questions. And again, I don't know that I can do justice to all of them. There are a couple of questions, your question and the other gentleman's question, that has essentially, I think the gentleman in the back about Mr. Camacho, I think he's it's about the power of crowds. Is essentially what happens if crowds get empowered and then create change and affect change, and then what happens after that when a smaller group then starts running things. And that what the gentleman in the back called the illusion of power, and as to the actual power. There is no doubt that crowds can be very powerful, and we have seen evidence of that throughout history and more recently too. What always happens is that you do need some concentration in order to get things going. And when you don't, you end up with a failed state. Essentially, failed states are nothing but situations in which no one has enough power. And the crowds, and therefore vigilantes and warlords and groups start running things, and they control pieces of territory and some functions, but essentially fails, when the crowds are empowered permanently forever and there is no structure to that power, you end up with a failed state. The theme about political parties, a very good question about, what happens if political parties get empowered and then they will also have the consequences of the three revolutions? Of course, that's true. But at the same time, you would expect, I do believe that the democracy works. And that at some point, if you have political parties that perform the functions of political parties in terms of interest aggregation and articulation, and then the training functions, and then in getting the capacity to govern, and if there is several of those, then you end up in a better place. But there is no doubt that they will also be affected by the three revolutions. And the final question is, what's next? I end the book making a very bold, highly personal prediction, that on the basis of everything I have studied and everything I have seen, I anticipate that we are going to witness a massive wave of political innovation in coming years. So think about the way you live today. Think about what you did since you started your morning. Almost everything you did today was touched by an innovation that took place 10 years ago or less. The level of innovation in the last decade or two has no precedent in human history. The way we communicate, the way we eat, the way we heal, the way we get sick, the way we travel, the way we opine, the way everything has been touched by technologies that are very recent. And I'm not just talking about Google and Wikipedia and all of the things that have been created in the last few years. I'm talking about the fact, for example, that in the last 10 years, more celestial bodies in the universe have been discovered than in the last 2,000 years. I'm talking about the decoding of the DNA. I'm talking about touch almost anything, and you will find an astounding level of innovation. Everything has been touched by innovation, except the way we govern ourselves. Everything has been moved. Everything has been transformed. Innovation has touched everything, except the way we govern ourselves. And that is unsustainable. And something will have to give. And what will give, I predict, is that that wave of innovation that we have seen in all those other realms will touch also the way we govern ourselves. So stay tuned, because a lot of things are going to happen in that realm. And thank you very much for having me.